The radio transmission was barely a whisper through the static. Who's shooting? Where is it coming from? In the chaos of the ambush, no one expected an answer from the intelligence analyst they'd left for dead 3 hours earlier. But Gwendolyn Sanchez wasn't dead. She was counting. Counting heartbeats, counting seconds, counting the exact number of steps between enemy positions. Because while everyone else saw her as just another desk officer who couldn't handle the field, she'd spent 18 months preparing for the moment when her calculations would mean the difference between survival and slaughter. This is the story of how the woman they never trusted with a weapon became the only reason any of them made it home alive. The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Falcon smelled of stale coffee and yesterday's frustration. Gwendolyn Sanchez sat in her usual position at the back corner table, her laptop open, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she cross-referenced satellite imagery with intercepted communications. Around her, the combat teams prepared for another patrol into hostile territory, their voices a mixture of bravado and carefully masked anxiety. At 26, Gwendolyn had been stationed at Falcon for 14 months. She was fluent in 3 languages, held advanced degrees in geospatial intelligence and signals analysis, and could predict enemy movements with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. But none of that mattered to the soldiers who saw her as nothing more than the analyst girl who never left the operations center. She was thin, bookish, and perpetually squinting at screens in the dim light of the intelligence bay. Her hands were soft, unmarked by the calluses that came from weapons training or field operations. When she spoke during briefings, her voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if she was sorry for interrupting the real soldiers with her data and predictions. "Sanchez, you got anything useful for us today?" Lieutenant Garrett asked, not bothering to look in her direction as he studied the patrol map spread across the main table. His tone carried the casual dismissiveness she'd grown accustomed to, the assumption that her contributions were optional background noise rather than critical intelligence. Gwendolyn pushed her glasses up her nose and stood, carrying her laptop to the main table. "Yes, sir. I've identified a pattern in enemy radio traffic that suggests they're establishing observation posts along Route Amber. Based on the signal triangulation and movement patterns over the past 72 hours, I believe they're preparing an ambush in Sector 4, probably within the next 48 hours. Garrett glanced at her screen, then back at his map. "Probably? That's not exactly actionable intelligence, Sanchez. The probability is 87% based on historical patterns and current communications intercepts," Gwendolyn replied, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of dismissal. "I can show you the correlation between." "Look," Sergeant Briggs interrupted from across the room, "we appreciate the number crunching, but we've been running patrols on Route Amber for 6 months. We know that terrain. If there was going to be an ambush, we'd see the signs." Gwendolyn felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the frustration of having valuable intelligence ignored because it came from someone who didn't fit their image of a credible source. "Respectfully, Sergeant, the signs are in the data. The enemy has changed their communication protocols 3 times in the past week, which indicates operational security for something significant. The signal pattern." "We'll keep your concerns noted," Garrett said, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. "But we've got real-world experience that trumps computer models. The patrol runs as planned." Gwendolyn returned to her corner table, her jaw tight. Around her, the combat teams continued their preparations, joking about the analyst worry and the way headquarters always saw threats that didn't exist. She heard Corporal Whitfield mutter to his buddy, "Sanchez probably thinks there's an ambush every time someone keys a radio. Can't let the desk jockeys spook us." She opened a new file on her laptop and continued her analysis, adding notes about the dismissed intelligence. This wasn't the first time her warnings had been ignored, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But Gwendolyn had learned something important during her 14 months at Falcon. If the combat teams wouldn't listen to her intelligence, she needed to be prepared to act on it herself. That's why she'd been doing something that no one at the base knew about. Every evening after her official duties ended, Gwendolyn had been conducting her own training program. She'd befriended one of the armory sergeants, a quiet man named Patterson who saw past her analyst designation to recognize someone genuinely interested in learning. He'd taught her weapons handling, starting with basic rifle marksmanship and progressing to more advanced techniques. She'd also been working with a combat medic named Torres, learning field trauma care during her off hours. Torres had been initially skeptical, asking why an analyst needed to know how to treat gunshot wounds and apply tourniquets. Gwendolyn had simply replied that knowledge was never wasted, and Torres had shrugged and agreed to teach her. But her most intensive secret training had been in combat tactics and field operations. She'd studied every after-action report from the past 2 years, memorizing terrain features, analyzing enemy tactics, learning from both successes and failures. She'd created detailed three-dimensional models of every patrol route, every village, every potential ambush site within 50 kilometers of the base. When other analysts spent their evenings watching movies or playing video games, Gwendolyn ran scenarios. She positioned theoretical enemy forces based on intelligence patterns, then worked out optimal response strategies. She studied ballistics, learned about fields of fire in dead space, memorized the effective ranges of every weapon system used by both friendly and enemy forces. None of this was part of her official duties. None of it was expected or encouraged. But Gwendolyn had recognized something that her colleagues hadn't. Intelligence analysis wasn't just about identifying threats from the safety of an operations center. Real intelligence officers needed to understand the ground truth, the reality of combat, the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. The patrol departed at dawn, 6 vehicles rolling out through the base gates toward Route Amber. Gwendolyn watched from the operations center, her stomach knotted with anxiety. The enemy radio traffic had intensified overnight, with coded phrases that her analysis suggested were final preparations for an operation. She'd updated her report and sent it to Lieutenant Garrett, who'd acknowledged it with a brief noted and no change to the patrol plan. She returned to her monitoring station, her headphones filled with the routine radio chatter of the patrol as they moved along their designated route. The morning was clear, the kind of deceptively peaceful day that made it easy to forget they were operating in a combat zone. Gwendolyn's screens displayed multiple data feeds, drone footage, signal intercepts, GPS tracking of friendly forces, and her own predictive models showing the most likely ambush locations. At 0847 hours, everything changed. The explosion was so powerful that Gwendolyn heard it through the open window of the operations center, a distant rumble that preceded the frantic radio transmissions by several seconds. Then the radio exploded with overlapping voices, shouting, screaming, the unmistakable sounds of chaos and combat. Contact! Contact! IED on lead vehicle. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Gwendolyn's training kicked in before conscious thought. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the patrol's exact location and overlaying it with her threat assessment models. The ambush was happening exactly where she'd predicted, in Sector 4 of Route Amber, with enemy positions established in the elevated terrain on both sides of the road. Base, this is Falcon 1-6, Garrett's voice came through the radio, strained but controlled. We've got casualties. Lead vehicle is destroyed. Taking effective fire from north and south ridgelines. Request immediate QRF and air support. Major Reeves, the operations officer, grabbed the radio handset. Falcon 1-6, this is base. QRF is spinning up now. Air support is 15 minutes out. Can you identify enemy positions? Negative, negative, came Garrett's reply, punctuated by the sound of gunfire. They're well concealed. We can't get effective fire on them. We're pinned down. Gwendolyn stared at her screens, her mind processing information at lightning speed. She could see the situation with absolute clarity. The patrol was trapped in a kill zone, with enemy positions that had been carefully prepared and camouflaged. The attacking force had established interlocking fields of fire, creating a situation where any movement by the patrol would expose them to multiple shooters. But Gwendolyn could see something else, something that the trapped patrol couldn't. Her analysis of the terrain, combined with the enemy radio traffic she'd been monitoring, gave her a clear picture of where each enemy position was located. She knew their approximate numbers, their likely weapon systems, and most importantly, their blind spots. "Major," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos of the operations center. "I can identify the enemy positions." Reeves turned to look at her, his face tight with stress. "You're monitoring their radio traffic?" "Yes, sir, but more than that. I've been tracking their preparation for this ambush for 3 days. I know where they are." She pulled up a detailed map on the main display screen, rapidly marking positions with red icons. "Primary machine gun position here, on the north ridge. Secondary position here. Snipers likely here and here. Command element approximately here, based on radio direction finding." Reeves studied the map, then keyed his radio. "Falcon 1-6, be advised we have intelligence suggesting enemy positions at the following coordinates." He began reading off the information Gwendolyn had provided. "Base, how solid is this intel?" Garrett's voice came back, skeptical even in the midst of the firefight. Before Reeves could answer, a new voice broke into the radio net, cold and professional. "All Falcon elements, this is Overwatch 3. We have eyes on target area. Confirm multiple enemy positions consistent with provided coordinates." Analyst was right. The drone operator, circling overhead with thermal imaging, had just confirmed what Gwendolyn had predicted. The operations center fell silent for a moment, everyone turning to look at the quiet analyst who'd just proven she knew more about the battlefield than the soldiers actually on it. "Falcon 1-6, this is base," Reeves continued. "Confirmed enemy positions. Air support inbound your location, 12 minutes. QRF rolling in 10. Can you hold?" "Negative, base. We've got 3 urgent casualties and we're almost out of ammunition. If we don't move in the next 5 minutes, we're not going to make it to air support." Gwendolyn's mind raced through possibilities. The QRF would arrive too late. Air support would arrive too late. The patrol needed options now, and she was the only person in the operations center who understood the tactical situation well enough to provide them. She grabbed a headset and, before anyone could stop her, keyed into the patrol's radio frequency. "Falcon 1-6, this is Analyst Sanchez. I have a possible solution." There was a pause, filled with the sounds of combat. Then Garrett's voice, edged with desperation and disbelief. "Sanchez? What the hell are you doing on this net?" "Saving your life, sir. Listen carefully. Based on enemy positions and terrain analysis, there's a dead space approximately 30 meters to your southwest. It's below the angle of fire from both ridgelines and outside the effective range of their positions. If you can reach that location, you'll have cover for casualty evacuation and a defensive position until support arrives." "How do you know there's a dead space there?" "Because I've studied this terrain for 6 months, sir. I know every depression, every fold in the ground, every line of sight. Trust me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence on the radio stretched for 3 heartbeats. Gwendolyn could hear the rapid crack of gunfire, the shouts of wounded men, the chaos of a unit fighting for survival. She held her breath, waiting for Garrett's response, knowing that her credibility hung on this single moment. "Major Reeves," Garrett's voice finally came through, tight with tension. "Is Sanchez really suggesting we move under fire based on her map reading?" Reeves looked at Gwendolyn, his expression a mixture of doubt and desperate hope. She met his gaze steadily, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Sir, the terrain analysis is solid. That dead space exists. It's their only option." Reeves made his decision. "Falcon 1-6, base confirms the analyst's assessment. Recommend you execute her suggestion." Another pause, shorter this time. "Copy that, base. We're moving. Sanchez, if you're wrong about this, I'm going to personally." His words were cut off by the sounds of movement and intensified gunfire. Gwendolyn watched the drone feed on her screen, her hands clenched into fists as she tracked the patrol's GPS signals. The vehicles that could still move began a desperate sprint toward the southwest, exposing themselves briefly to enemy fire before disappearing into the fold of ground she'd identified. The enemy radio traffic exploded with confused chatter. Gwendolyn's headphones filled with urgent Arabic as the ambush force tried to reacquire their targets. She translated rapidly for Major Reeves. "They've lost visual contact. They're confused about where the patrol went. They're repositioning to try to get new angles of fire." Falcon 1-6, base. "What's your status?" Garrett's voice came back, breathless but alive. "Base, we're in the dead space." Sanchez was right. "We've got cover and we're consolidating our casualties. But we can still hear them moving around up there." "How long until air support?" Gwendolyn checked her screens. 9 minutes, sir." "We need to keep them pinned in that location," Reeves said, studying the tactical display. "If they try to move before air support arrives, the enemy will spot them and adjust their positions." Gwendolyn's mind was already working through the problem. The enemy force was confused but not defeated. They would be probing, searching for new firing positions that would allow them to engage the patrol in their new location. The drone feed showed movement along the ridgelines, enemy fighters shifting positions. She pulled up her detailed analysis of the enemy force structure, the communications intercepts she'd been collecting for days. An idea formed, audacious and dangerous, but potentially effective. "Major," she said quietly, "I can buy them more time." Reeves turned to her. "How?" "The enemy commander is using radio frequency 427 MHz for tactical coordination. I've been monitoring his traffic for 3 days. I know his call signs, his communication protocols, his voice patterns. I can jam their communications, or better yet, I can feed them false information." "You want to impersonate enemy radio traffic?" Reeves looked skeptical. "Your Arabic is that good?" "My Arabic is native level, sir. My mother was from Lebanon. I grew up speaking it at home." This was something else no one at the base knew about her, another capability that had been overlooked because she was just the quiet analyst who never spoke up. Reeves considered for a moment, then nodded sharply. "Do it. Anything that keeps them confused for the next 9 minutes might save lives." Gwendolyn's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing the communications equipment that would allow her to transmit on the enemy frequency. She'd practiced this scenario in theory, studying the cadence and terminology of enemy radio communications, but she'd never actually attempted it in a real combat situation. She keyed the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice was transformed. The quiet, apologetic analyst disappeared, replaced by an urgent male voice speaking rapid Arabic with the clipped authority of a military commander. "All units, enemy forces are retreating to the east. Reposition to intercept. Command element, move to grid 734-521. The enemy radio net erupted with responses, confusion mixing with the instinct to obey what sounded like legitimate orders. Gwendolyn watched the drone feed as enemy fighters began moving away from their optimal positions, following the false orders she'd just given them. "Unbelievable," Reeves muttered, staring at the screen. "They're actually doing it." Gwendolyn transmitted again, reinforcing the deception with additional false commands, careful to match the communication style and terminology she'd observed over weeks of monitoring. She was walking a tightrope, knowing that one wrong phrase or unnatural inflection could expose the deception and make the situation worse. The enemy commander's voice suddenly cut through the radio traffic, sharp with suspicion. "All units, disregard previous orders. Authenticate your last transmission, command element." Gwendolyn's mind raced. She'd been discovered. The deception had bought perhaps 3 minutes of confusion, but now the enemy was alert to the possibility of false communications. The enemy commander repeated his demand for authentication, his voice hard with suspicion. Gwendolyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she made a split-second decision. Instead of trying to continue the deception, she switched tactics entirely. She began transmitting on multiple frequencies simultaneously, flooding the enemy radio net with overlapping recordings of their own previous communications, creating a wall of confusing noise that made coordination nearly impossible. It was electronic chaos, a technique she'd read about in signals intelligence manuals but never attempted in practice. The enemy radio traffic dissolved into frustrated shouting as commanders tried and failed to communicate with their units. Gwendolyn monitored the drone feed, watching as the enemy forces' coordinated ambush degraded into isolated pockets of fighters who couldn't coordinate their movements or share intelligence about the patrol's location. "Air support is 3 minutes out," the operations watch officer announced. Gwendolyn maintained her radio jamming, her fingers dancing across multiple keyboards as she adjusted frequencies to counter the enemy's attempts to find clear channels. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the air-conditioned cool of the operations center. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, watching the analyst perform combat operations that should have been far outside her expertise. "Falcon 1-6, base," Reeves transmitted. "Air support approaching your position. Mark your location with smoke." "Base, Falcon 1-6. Purple smoke deployed. Be advised, we can hear enemy movement close to our position. They're searching for us." The tension in the operations center was suffocating. Through the drone feed, Gwendolyn could see enemy fighters moving methodically through the terrain, slowly working their way toward the dead space where the patrol sheltered. They were perhaps 200 meters away, close enough that contact was inevitable within minutes. The whine of jet engines cut through the radio static. "Falcon 1-6, this is Reaper 2-1. We have your purple smoke in sight. Stand by for danger, close air support." What followed was a precisely choreographed dance of destruction. The fighter jets screamed across the ridgelines, their weapons systems locked onto the enemy positions that Gwendolyn had identified hours ago. Explosions rippled across the high ground, the concussive force visible even through the drone's distant camera. The enemy radio traffic, what little Gwendolyn could hear through her jamming, dissolved into panic and screaming. The ambush force that had seemed so deadly minutes ago was now scattered and broken, their carefully prepared positions turned into death traps by air support that knew exactly where to strike. "Falcon 1-6, base. Air support has suppressed enemy positions. QRF is 2 minutes from your location. Prepare for evacuation of casualties." Garrett's voice came back, ragged with exhaustion and relief. "Copy that, base. Tell Sanchez." He paused, searching for words. "Tell her she can be on my team anytime." The operations center erupted in relieved cheers. Major Reeves put a hand on Gwendolyn's shoulder, his grip firm with respect. "Outstanding work, Sanchez. You saved that patrol." But Gwendolyn barely heard the praise. Her eyes were fixed on the drone feed, her analyst's mind still processing information, still looking for threats. And she saw something that made her blood run cold. "Major," she said urgently, "we have a problem." The celebration died instantly. "What is it?" Gwendolyn's fingers flew across her keyboard, zooming the drone camera on a section of terrain south of the patrol's position. "There's a secondary enemy force. Look here, thermal signatures of approximately 15 personnel moving through this ravine. They're not part of the ambush force. They're moving toward the QRF's approach route." Reeves leaned in, studying the feed. Could be civilians. Could be shepherds moving their flocks. At this time of day? In this terrain? Moving in tactical formation? Gwendolyn pulled up the intercept logs from the past hour, her mind making connections at lightning speed. "Sir, I picked up a brief radio transmission 20 minutes ago on a different frequency from the ambush force. I flagged it as anomalous but didn't have time to analyze it during the engagement. If I'm right, this is a separate element positioned to ambush our rescue force. Can you confirm that?" Gwendolyn was already working the problem, cross-referencing signal patterns with movement data. 60% probability based on available data. "But sir, if I'm right and we don't warn the QRF, they're going to drive straight into another ambush." Reeves made his decision instantly. "Get on the radio. Warn them." Gwendolyn keyed the microphone. "Raptor 1-1, this is base. Be advised, possible hostile force along your approach route, grid coordinates 736, 518. Recommend alternate route or proceed with caution. The QRF commander's response was skeptical. Base, Raptor 11. We're not showing any hostile contacts on that grid. Are you sure about this? Negative confirmation, Raptor 11. Assessment based on thermal signatures and signals intelligence. But I'm the analyst who predicted the primary ambush, sir. There was a pause. Then, copy that, base. We'll proceed with caution. All vehicles, combat spacing, weapons free. The QRF slowed their approach, their vehicles spreading out into combat formation as they neared the ravine where Gwendolyn had spotted the suspicious thermal signatures. Through the drone feed, she watched the scene unfold with her heart in her throat, knowing that she'd just staked her newly earned credibility on an assessment that was far from certain. The QRF vehicles advanced slowly, their gunners scanning the terrain with heightened alertness. Gwendolyn kept her eyes fixed on the thermal signatures in the ravine, watching for any indication that would confirm or deny her assessment. The figures remained stationary, which could mean they were waiting in ambush or simply that they were civilians taking shelter from the airstrikes. Base, Raptor 11. We're at grid 736, 518. Deploying dismounts to investigate. Gwendolyn watched as soldiers dismounted from the vehicles, moving in tactical formation toward the ravine. Every muscle in her body was tense, her analyst's mind screaming that something was wrong even though she couldn't point to definitive proof. Then one of the thermal signatures moved, rising from concealment with the distinctive shape of a rocket launcher. Raptor 11, RPG, you're 3 o'clock. Gwendolyn shouted into the microphone. The warning came just in time. The QRF soldiers dove for cover as the rocket-propelled grenades screamed past their position, missing the lead vehicle by meters. The ravine erupted with gunfire as the hidden enemy force revealed themselves, confirming Gwendolyn's assessment in the worst possible way. But this time, the ambush failed. Warned by Gwendolyn's intelligence, the QRF was prepared and deployed in a formation that allowed them to return effective fire. The engagement was brief and decisive, ending with the enemy force either dead or fleeing into the mountains. Base, Raptor 11. Contact eliminated. Sanchez, if you're listening, that was solid intel. You just saved our lives too. Major Reeves looked at Gwendolyn with something approaching awe. How did you know? I didn't know, sir. Not for certain. But the patterns were there in the data. Enemy forces in this region have used secondary ambush elements before. It fit their tactical doctrine. She paused, then added quietly, I've studied every ambush in this area for the past 2 years. I knew what to look for. The QRF reached the pin-down patrol 15 minutes later, and the evacuation proceeded smoothly. Wounded soldiers were loaded into vehicles, equipment was recovered, and the entire force began the journey back to base. Gwendolyn monitored every step of the process, her vigilance never wavering until the last vehicle rolled through the base gates. As the operations center began to stand down from the emergency, Gwendolyn felt the adrenaline drain from her system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She'd been running on pure focus for hours, and now that the crisis was over, the weight of what had happened began to settle on her shoulders. She'd saved lives today. Multiple patrols, multiple soldiers who would have died without her intelligence and her unorthodox interventions. But she'd also revealed capabilities that she'd been carefully keeping hidden, skills and knowledge that went far beyond what anyone expected from a desk-bound analyst. Sanchez, my office. Now. Major Reeves's voice cut through her thoughts. Gwendolyn followed him to his office, her stomach knotting with uncertainty. She'd acted without authorization multiple times during the crisis, had taken control of radio communications, had made tactical recommendations that were far outside her official role. The fact that her actions had been successful didn't necessarily mean they would be approved in retrospect. Reeves closed the door and gestured for her to sit. He remained standing, arms crossed, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Analyst Sanchez, he began formally, today you violated approximately a dozen protocols, exceeded your authority on multiple occasions, and involved yourself in tactical operations for which you have no official training or authorization. Gwendolyn kept her expression neutral, her hands folded in her lap. Yes, sir. You also saved the lives of 19 soldiers who would almost certainly have died without your intervention. He paused, letting that sink in. So here's my question, where the hell did you learn to do all that? Gwendolyn took a deep breath. Sir, I've been conducting independent training and study for the past 14 months. I recognized that my intelligence assessments were being dismissed because I didn't understand ground truth, so I decided to learn. Sergeant Patterson taught me weapons handling. Torres taught me combat medicine. I studied every after-action report, every tactical scenario, every piece of terrain within our operational area. Why? That's not part of your job description. Because good intelligence officers need to understand what happens when their analysis meets reality, sir. Because I was tired of watching my warnings get ignored and then watching people die. Because I wanted to be more than just the analyst girl who everyone dismissed. Reeves was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. You realize that what you did today, the radio deception, the tactical recommendations, that goes beyond traditional intelligence work. You were essentially functioning as a combat controller without the training or authorization. I understand that, sir. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences. I'm not talking about consequences, Sanchez. I'm talking about capabilities. He leaned forward, his expression intense. You have skills that this unit desperately needs, but you're wasted sitting behind a desk in the operations center. I'm recommending you for immediate transfer to the Tactical Intelligence Support Team. Gwendolyn stared at Major Reeves, certain she'd misheard. Sir, the Tactical Intelligence Support Team is for experienced field operatives with years of combat experience. I'm just an analyst. You stopped being just an analyst the moment you talked a trapped patrol through an escape route while simultaneously conducting psychological operations against enemy forces, Reeves replied. The TIST embeds with combat units, provides real-time intelligence support during operations. It's exactly what you've been training yourself to do, except now you'll do it officially. With respect, sir, I don't think the combat teams are going to want me in the field with them. I'm not exactly their first choice for field operations. Reeves smiled grimly. After today, I suspect you'll be surprised. Lieutenant Garrett specifically requested that you be assigned to his unit permanently. Said he wants someone who actually knows what they're talking about instead of analysts who just guess. The irony wasn't lost on Gwendolyn. The same officer who'd dismissed her warnings this morning was now requesting her as a permanent team member. Success, it seemed, had a way of changing perceptions. But Reeves wasn't finished. However, there's a condition. If you're going to be in the field, you need official training. Combat skills, advanced weapons qualifications, tactical communications, the whole package. It's going to be intensive, probably the hardest 4 months of your life. I understand, sir. When do I start? After you take 72 hours of mandatory leave. Reeves's expression softened slightly. You've been running on adrenaline for hours. Get some rest, process what happened today, then come back ready to work. Gwendolyn left the office in a daze. As she walked across the base toward her quarters, she noticed something different in how soldiers looked at her. Instead of looking through her or past her, they actually saw her. Several nodded respectfully as she passed. One sergeant stopped her to shake her hand and thank her for saving his buddies in the patrol. She found Torres waiting outside her quarters, a rare smile on his usually serious face. Heard you had quite a day, analyst. Word travels fast. Word travels instantly when someone does what you did. He gestured toward the medical facility. I've got 3 patients in there who are alive because you knew exactly where to tell the patrol to go. 2 of them want to meet you, thank you personally. Gwendolyn felt emotion well up in her chest, threatening to overwhelm the professional composure she'd maintained throughout the crisis. I was just doing my job. No, Torres said firmly. Your job was to analyze intelligence and write reports. What you did today was save lives. There's a difference. She visited the wounded soldiers, men she'd known only as names on patrol rosters and faces in the chow hall. They looked at her with gratitude and respect, treating her not as the invisible analyst but as the person who'd pulled them out of an impossible situation. Later, back in her quarters, Gwendolyn sat on her cot and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day. The fear, the uncertainty, the moments when she'd made decisions that could have gone terribly wrong. She thought about the intelligence report that had been dismissed, the warnings that had been ignored, and how close they'd come to disaster because experience was valued over analysis. But she also thought about the moment when Lieutenant Garrett had trusted her enough to follow her recommendations into that dead space. The moment when Major Reeves had authorized her unorthodox interventions. The moment when her months of secret preparation had transformed from questionable dedication into life-saving capability. Her laptop sat on the small desk, still displaying the analysis tools she'd been using when the crisis began. Gwendolyn opened a new file and began documenting everything that had happened, not for any official report, but for herself. The lessons learned, the tactical insights, the patterns she'd observed in enemy behavior. Because even though she'd been validated today, even though she'd proven her worth in the most dramatic way possible, Gwendolyn knew that the Real challenge was just beginning. The combat teams might respect her now, but respect earned in one crisis could be lost just as quickly if she failed to maintain the standards she'd set for herself. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Sergeant Patterson, the armory sergeant who'd been teaching her weapons handling in secret. "Heard you put those shooting lessons to good use today," he said, though Gwendolyn hadn't actually fired a weapon during the crisis. "Well, not directly. But you put the training mindset to use. I couldn't have done any of it without what you taught me, Sergeant. Understanding weapons systems, fields of fire, tactical principles, all of that came from our sessions." Patterson nodded, looking oddly proud. "You know, when you first asked me to teach you, I thought you were crazy. An analyst wanting to learn combat skills? Seemed like a waste of time. I'm glad you proved me wrong." After he left, Gwendolyn returned to her documentation, but her mind kept drifting to the bigger picture. The sun rose over forward operating base Falcon, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Gwendolyn stood at the edge of the base perimeter, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands as she watched the light spread across the terrain she'd studied for so long. Today marked the beginning of her 72 hours of mandatory leave, but her mind refused to rest. The operations center had called her twice already, asking questions about enemy communications patterns and terrain analysis. Major Reeves had personally ordered her to stop answering her phone, reminding her that rest was not optional. But Gwendolyn found it difficult to disconnect from the work that had defined her for 14 months. She thought about the patrol, now safely back on base, and about how close they'd come to annihilation. The what-ifs haunted her. What if she'd been less prepared? What if she'd doubted her analysis? What if she'd followed protocol and kept silent while soldiers died because her warnings had been dismissed? "Mind if I join you?" Lieutenant Garrett's voice startled her from her thoughts. He approached slowly, as if uncertain of his welcome, carrying his own cup of coffee. Gwendolyn gestured to the empty space beside her. "Of course, sir." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sunrise. Finally, Garrett spoke, his voice rough with something that might have been shame. "I owe you an apology, Sanchez. I dismissed your intelligence assessment before the patrol. If I'd listened to you, we might have avoided the whole situation. You made the decision based on the information and experience you had, sir. I don't hold that against you." "You should," Garrett said bluntly. "I let my assumptions about who you were interfere with evaluating the quality of your intelligence. I saw an analyst who'd never been in combat, and I assumed that meant you didn't understand the reality on the ground. I was wrong." Gwendolyn considered her response carefully. "Sir, I spent 14 months trying to prove I understood the ground truth. I studied, I trained, I prepared. But none of that mattered because I didn't fit the expected profile of someone with valuable tactical insight. The problem wasn't your individual decision. The problem was systemic assumptions about what analysts can and cannot contribute." Garrett nodded slowly. which is why I requested you for permanent attachment to my unit. I want someone who sees the battlefield the way you do, who can connect intelligence to tactical reality. But I need to know something. Are you really prepared for what that means? Field operations aren't like yesterday. Yesterday was extraordinary. Normal operations are weeks of routine punctuated by moments of terror. I understand that, sir. And yes, I'm prepared. I've been preparing for 14 months. Why? Garrett asked the question that others had been asking since yesterday. Why go to all that effort for a job that wasn't yours? Gwendolyn was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. Because I watched soldiers die in operations where good intelligence might have saved them. Because I had warnings dismissed and then had to write reports about casualties that could have been prevented. Because I was tired of being invisible, of being treated like furniture that produced data instead of a soldier who could contribute to the mission. She turned to face Garrett directly. I didn't train in secret because I wanted glory or recognition. I did it because I couldn't stand watching people die when I had information that might save them, but no one would listen because I was just the analyst girl. Garrett met her gaze, and she saw respect there, genuine and hard-earned. Well, people are listening now. Major Reeves is fast-tracking your TIST assignment. By next month, you'll be embedded with my unit full-time. That means you'll be on patrol with us, living in forward positions, experiencing everything we experience. I'm ready for that, sir. I hope so. Because the soldiers who respect you now will turn on you fast if you can't keep up or if you become a liability in the field. Respect in this unit isn't given, it's earned continuously. After Garrett left, Gwendolyn walked to the base gym. Despite Reeves's orders to rest, she needed to move, to process the emotional aftermath of yesterday's crisis through physical activity. The gym was nearly empty in the early morning, just a few soldiers completing their pre-duty workouts. She started with a run on the treadmill, letting her mind drift as her body found its rhythm. Yesterday had changed everything. She was no longer the overlooked analyst, the invisible woman who counted equipment and wrote reports that no one read. She'd proven herself in the most dramatic way possible. But Garrett's warning echoed in her thoughts. The respect she'd earned could disappear just as quickly if she failed to live up to the standards she'd set. Field operations would test her in ways that yesterday's crisis hadn't. It was one thing to perform brilliantly during a single emergency. It was another thing entirely to maintain that standard day after day, week after week, while dealing with the physical and mental stress of extended combat operations. As she moved from the treadmill to strength training, Gwendolyn noticed other soldiers watching her with undisguised curiosity. Word of her actions had spread throughout the base, transforming her from invisible to infamous overnight. Some of the attention was positive, but she could see skepticism in other faces, doubt about whether her success was skill or simply luck. Sergeant Briggs, who'd dismissed her intelligence assessment before the patrol, approached as she finished a set of pull-ups. "Sanchez, got a minute?" She dropped from the bar, wiping sweat from her face. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" Briggs looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "I wanted to say I was wrong. About your assessment before the patrol. About your capabilities. About pretty much everything I assumed about you. I appreciate that, Sergeant." "No, you don't understand." Briggs shook his head. "I've been in combat for 8 years. I've seen analysts come and go, most of them couldn't find their ass with both hands and a map when it came to understanding real operations. I lumped you in with them without giving you a chance to prove yourself. That was unprofessional and it nearly got people killed." Gwendolyn studied Briggs carefully, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. "Sergeant, I spent 14 months being invisible. Being dismissed. I understood why it happened, even if I didn't like it. The important thing is that when it mattered, the right people listened." "That's generous of you," Briggs said. "More generous than I deserve. But I want you to know that I'm going to make sure the other NCOs understand what happened yesterday. We need to stop dismissing intelligence assessments just because they come from analysts without combat experience." After Briggs left, Gwendolyn continued her workout, but her mind was processing the conversation. The culture at Forward Operating Base Falcon was changing, shifted by the undeniable evidence of what happened when intelligence was taken seriously. But cultural change was fragile, easily reversed if she failed to maintain her performance. She spent the rest of her mandatory leave period in a strange limbo, officially off duty but constantly thinking about the work waiting for her. She updated her personal analysis files, refined her terrain models, and studied after-action reports from yesterday's engagement. Rest, it seemed, was not something her mind was capable of when there was still so much to learn. On the third day of her leave, Major Reeves summoned her to his office. She arrived to find not just Reeves, but also Colonel Hammond, the base commander she'd only seen from a distance during formal briefings. "Specialist Sanchez, reporting as ordered, sir." Hammond gestured for her to sit. He was a lean man with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Sanchez, I've read the after-action reports from the ambush 3 days ago. What you accomplished was extraordinary, but it also raised some serious questions about how we've been utilizing our intelligence personnel." Gwendolyn remained silent, waiting for Hammond to continue. "Major Reeves has recommended you for immediate assignment to the Tactical Intelligence Support Team, with accelerated training to prepare you for field operations. I'm here to tell you that recommendation has been approved. But I'm also here to make sure you understand what you're getting into." Hammond leaned forward, his expression serious. "Field intelligence work isn't about dramatic rescues and crisis management. Most of the time, it's grinding routine punctuated by moments of absolute terror. You'll be living with combat units in forward positions, sometimes for weeks at a time. You'll be expected to keep up with soldiers who've been training for combat roles their entire careers. And if you can't maintain that standard, you'll be pulled back to the operations center faster than you can blink. I understand, sir. Do you? Because there's a difference between proving yourself once during a crisis and maintaining that performance over months of field operations. The soldiers who respect you now will turn on you the moment you become a liability instead of an asset." Gwendolyn met Hammond's gaze steadily. "Sir, I've been preparing for field operations for 14 months. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I knew that effective intelligence work requires understanding ground truth. I'm ready for whatever challenges come with the TIST assignment." Hammond studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Your training starts next week. You'll be working with Sergeant First Class Reynolds, our senior TIST operator. He's going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed. If you wash out, you'll return to standard analyst duties with no prejudice. But if you make it through, you'll be assigned to Lieutenant Garrett's unit as their embedded intelligence specialist." After the meeting, Gwendolyn walked across the base toward the intelligence section, her mind processing the magnitude of what she'd just committed to. 4 months of intensive training, learning skills that most analysts never approached. It was an opportunity she'd been working toward for over a year, but now that it was real, the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. She found Torres at the medical facility, checking inventory. He looked up as she entered, a knowing smile on his face. "Let me guess, Hammond approved the TIST assignment." "How did you know?" "Because Hammond doesn't waste time. When he sees capability, he acts on it." Torres set down his clipboard. "So now you get to experience what it's really like to work with combat units in the field. It's going to be brutal, Sanchez. Reynolds is legendary for washing out candidates who don't meet his standards." "I'll meet his standards," Gwendolyn said with more confidence than she felt. "I believe you will. But here's some advice: the training is going to test your physical capabilities, but that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is earning the trust of soldiers who've been working together for years. They'll test you in ways that have nothing to do with your official curriculum." That evening, Gwendolyn sat in her quarters and wrote an email to her sister back home in Portugal. She tried to explain what had happened, the ambush and the rescue and the dramatic change in her circumstances. But as she wrote, she realized how inadequate words were to capture the complexity of the past few days. She'd saved lives through a combination of preparation, intelligence, and willingness to act when others hesitated. But she'd also revealed capabilities that transformed how others saw her, and with that transformation came new expectations and new pressures. The invisible analyst had become visible, and visibility brought its own challenges. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patterson. Heard about the TIST assignment. Proud of you. But remember, the hard part isn't proving you can do it once. The hard part is proving you can do it every day. Gwendolyn smiled at the message, recognizing the wisdom in Patterson's words. Yesterday's success had opened a door, but walking through that door meant accepting responsibility for maintaining the standards she'd set. There would be no more hiding behind the analyst designation, no more being invisible. She'd demanded to be seen as capable, and now she would have to prove that capability repeatedly. Training began at dawn the following Monday. Sergeant First Class Reynolds was exactly what Torres had warned her about, a compact man with weathered features and eyes that evaluated her with professional skepticism. He stood in the training yard with his arms crossed, watching as Gwendolyn approached in full field gear. Specialist Sanchez, I've read the reports about your performance during the ambush. Impressive stuff. But let me be clear about something, this training program has a 70% washout rate. Most candidates can't handle the physical demands, the mental stress, or the reality of what field intelligence work actually requires. You have no combat experience, minimal physical training beyond what you've done on your own, and you're about half the size of most candidates I've trained. Gwendolyn kept her expression neutral, recognizing the test for what it was. Reynolds was establishing baseline expectations, seeing if she'd argue or make excuses. I understand, Sergeant. I'm ready to begin. We'll see. Drop your pack and give me 20 pull-ups. Standard grip, full extension. The first week was designed to break her. Reynolds pushed her through physical training that would have been challenging for soldiers twice her size, 12-mile runs in full gear, obstacle courses timed to the second, endless repetitions of exercises designed to build the specific muscle groups needed for field operations. Every night, Gwendolyn collapsed into her cot with muscles screaming, only to wake before dawn and do it again. But the physical training was only part of the curriculum. Reynolds also tested her tactical knowledge, throwing scenarios at her that required instant analysis and decision-making under pressure. He'd describe a developing situation and demand her assessment in 30 seconds, then critique every assumption and conclusion she made. Your intelligence says enemy forces are moving through Sector 4, Reynolds would say. You've got a patrol in the area. What do you recommend? Pull them back to defensible position grid 723, establish overwatch, wait for enemy movement patterns to clarify. Wrong. You just abandoned the high ground and gave the enemy freedom of movement. Try again. These sessions were brutal in their own way, attacking not her body but her confidence in her analytical abilities. Reynolds was teaching her that field intelligence required different instincts than operations center analysis, faster decisions based on incomplete information. The weapons training was the most revelatory part of the curriculum. Gwendolyn had learned basic marksmanship from Patterson, but Reynolds taught her combat shooting, fast target acquisition, shooting while moving, engaging multiple targets under stress. He pushed her through scenarios that combined physical exhaustion with the need for precise shooting, teaching her that combat accuracy meant nothing if she couldn't maintain it while gasping for breath and pumped full of adrenaline. In the field, you're not going to have time to set up the perfect shot, Reynolds explained during one particularly grueling session. You're going to be tired, scared, and moving. I need to know you can still hit what you're aiming at under those conditions. By the third week, Gwendolyn noticed changes in how Reynolds treated her. The constant skepticism remained, but it was now mixed with something approaching respect. She was keeping pace with the training, meeting standards that washed out most candidates. Her small size, which everyone assumed would be a liability, actually worked in her favor for certain tasks requiring flexibility and the ability to move through confined spaces. The turning point came during a field exercise in week 4. Reynolds took her into the mountains with a small training unit, simulating a patrol in hostile territory. The scenario required her to provide real-time intelligence analysis while moving with the unit, maintaining situational awareness while dealing with the physical demands of mountainous terrain. They were 3 hours into the exercise when Reynolds called a halt. "Sanchez, you've just received intel that enemy forces are setting up an ambush ahead of our position. You've got 2 minutes to analyze the situation and recommend a course of action. Go." Gwendolyn's mind shifted into high gear, processing the terrain, the intelligence parameters of the scenario, the capabilities of their training unit. She could see the situation with absolute clarity, recognizing patterns from her months of study. "Recommendation: we redirect through this ravine," she said, pointing to a feature on her map. "It adds 15 minutes to our movement time, but it bypasses the likely ambush site and puts us in a position to flank any enemy force positioned along our original route." Reynolds studied the map, then nodded slowly. "Explain your reasoning." Gwendolyn walked him through her analysis, the terrain features that would appeal to an ambushing force, the sight lines and fields of fire, the alternative routes that balanced tactical advantage against time constraints. As she spoke, she could see Reynolds' expression shift from skepticism to something approaching approval. "That's solid analysis, Sanchez. You're thinking like a field operator, not an operations center analyst. That's the distinction most candidates never make." The remaining weeks of training built on that foundation. Reynolds pushed her through increasingly complex scenarios, teaching her to integrate intelligence analysis with tactical decision-making. He taught her advanced communications procedures, combat medicine beyond what Torres had shown her, and the subtle skills of working with combat units who might not initially trust an intelligence specialist embedded in their ranks. The final examination came in week 16, a 72-hour field exercise that combined everything she'd learned. Reynolds and his training team created a scenario that required Gwendolyn to function as the intelligence specialist for a patrol operating in hostile territory, providing real-time analysis while dealing with the physical and mental stress of extended field operations. The deployment began at dawn, 3 helicopters lifting off from forward operating base Falcon carrying Garrett's unit toward a forward position in hostile territory. Gwendolyn sat among the combat soldiers, her gear identical to theirs, her role now officially integrated into their operational structure. The nervous anticipation she'd felt during training had been replaced by focused calm, her mind already processing the intelligence briefings and terrain analysis. Lieutenant Garrett's voice came through her headset. "Sanchez, we're approaching the landing zone. Any last-minute intelligence updates?" Gwendolyn checked her tablet, reviewing the latest signal intercepts and pattern analysis. "Negative, sir. Enemy activity in the sector remains consistent with morning briefing. No indicators of immediate threats to the landing zone." The helicopter touched down smoothly, and the unit deployed with practiced efficiency. Gwendolyn moved with them, no longer the outsider watching from a distance, but an integral part of the team. They established a defensive perimeter while she set up her communications and analysis equipment, ready to provide real-time intelligence as operations developed. The first 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Gwendolyn worked alongside soldiers who'd once dismissed her capabilities, providing intelligence assessments that guided their patrol routes and tactical decisions. Some of the team members were initially skeptical about having an analyst embedded with them, but her performance quickly silenced doubts. On the 4th day, during a routine patrol, Gwendolyn detected anomalous radio traffic that matched patterns she'd studied for months. "Sir, I'm picking up enemy communications that suggest movement in our operational area. Based on the pattern, they're establishing observation posts to monitor our activities." Garrett trusted her assessment immediately. "Can you identify their positions?" Gwendolyn worked through the signal analysis with practiced efficiency, triangulating the radio sources and overlaying them with terrain data. 3 positions, sir. Here, and here." She marked them on the tactical display. "They're trying to establish coverage of our primary patrol routes. Recommendations? We can avoid them by redirecting through this valley, or we can use their observation posts against them by feeding them false information about our movements and intentions." Garrett studied the display, then smiled. "I like the second option. Show me how it works." Over the next week, Gwendolyn orchestrated a deception operation that confused enemy intelligence gathering and allowed Garrett's unit to operate with greater freedom. She monitored enemy communications, identified their information collection priorities, and helped the unit present a false picture of their capabilities and intentions. It was intelligence work at its finest, using knowledge and analysis to shape enemy perceptions and create tactical advantages. The transformation was complete. Gwendolyn was no longer the invisible analyst, no longer the woman dismissed and underestimated. She was Specialist Sanchez, tactical intelligence specialist, a soldier whose contributions were valued and whose assessments guided life and death decisions. 6 weeks into the deployment, Major Reeves visited their forward position. He found Gwendolyn working in the communications tent, her screens displaying multiple intelligence feeds and analysis tools. She looked up as he entered, her face showing the weathered confidence of someone who'd proven themselves in the field. "Sanchez, Lieutenant Garrett tells me you've been invaluable to his unit's operations. Says he can't imagine functioning without embedded intelligence support anymore." "Thank you, sir. I'm just doing the job I trained for." Reeves smiled. "You're doing more than that. You're changing how this entire base thinks about intelligence operations. We've got 3 other analysts who've requested TIST training because of what you've accomplished. You're not just succeeding personally, you're transforming our organizational culture." After Reeves left, Gwendolyn returned to her work, monitoring the intelligence feeds and updating her analysis files. But his words stayed with her, adding weight to what she'd achieved. She hadn't just proven her own capabilities, she'd opened doors for others who'd been overlooked and underestimated. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Gwendolyn stood at the edge of their defensive perimeter and reflected on her journey. 18 months ago, she'd been invisible, her warnings dismissed, her capabilities ignored. The soldiers around her had looked through her as if she didn't exist, unable to see past their assumptions about what an analyst could contribute. Now those same soldiers depended on her for their survival. They trusted her assessments, followed her recommendations, and treated her as an equal member of the team. She'd earned that trust through preparation, performance, and an unwavering refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose. Corporal Whitfield, who'd once questioned her dedication, approached with a cup of coffee. "Sanchez, got a minute? I wanted to ask your opinion about tomorrow's patrol route. Something feels off about the intelligence assessment from higher headquarters." Gwendolyn smiled, accepting the coffee. "Show me what you're seeing." They spread out the map and discussed the intelligence, 2 professionals evaluating information and making recommendations based on analysis and experience. It was a conversation that would have been impossible 18 months ago, when Whitfield couldn't imagine an analyst having valuable tactical insights. Later that night, Gwendolyn sat in her tent and composed an email to her sister. She tried to capture the magnitude of what she'd accomplished, the journey from invisible to indispensable. But words felt inadequate to express the complexity of transformation, the way persistence and preparation had overcome systemic dismissal. She'd saved lives through intelligence and quick thinking during that first ambush. But more importantly, she'd proven that assumptions about capability based on appearance or role were dangerous and limiting. The enemy had whispered who's shooting. Where, unable to comprehend that the quiet analyst could be their most dangerous adversary. That question had been answered definitively. Specialist Gwendolyn Sanchez was shooting, from positions of knowledge and preparation that made her invisible until the moment she chose to act. And where she was shooting from was a place of hard-earned respect and proven capability, a place she'd built for herself through 18 months of refusing to accept limitations. As she prepared for sleep, Gwendolyn thought about tomorrow's patrol and the intelligence work waiting for her. There would be more challenges, more opportunities to prove herself, more moments when her analysis would mean the difference between success and failure. She was ready for all of it, armed with skills and knowledge that transformed her from overlooked analyst into indispensable operator. The invisible woman had become impossible to ignore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.